In the spring of 1945, the Thousand-Year Reich was in its death throes. For the hundreds of thousands of Allied prisoners of war, liberation was not a single, clean event. It was a chaotic, terrifying, and drawn-out ordeal. As the Red Army advanced from the east, the Nazis, in a final act of desperate malice, emptied the stalags and oflags. They forced their prisoners onto the roads in the dead of winter. These were the death marches. Men who had already endured years of captivity were forced to march hundreds of miles, starving, in freezing temperatures, shot by guards if they faltered. Liberation, when it came, was often the sound of an American tank engine or a British machine gun, a sound that meant the end of the march. The gates were thrown open, and battle-hardened GI's men who had seen the worst of the front stopped and wept at the sight of their comrades, walking skeletons in tattered uniforms who had, against all odds, survived. Half a world away, the liberation of prisoners in the Pacific revealed a different, perhaps even darker, circle of hell. The Japanese military, bound by the Bushido Code, viewed surrender as the ultimate spiritual failure. Therefore, those who surrendered were not soldiers, but subhuman cargo, deserving of nothing but contempt and brutality. When Allied forces liberated camps like Cabanatuan in the Philippines, Changi in Singapore, or the slave labor camps of the Burma Death Railway, they were not prepared for what they found. These were the survivors of the Bataan Death March, of the Hell ships, unmarked transport ships that were often sunk by American submarines, and of systematic torture and starvation. They were men whose skin was stretched like yellow parchment over their bones, their bodies racked with beriberi, dysentery, and tropical ulcers. The full, uncensored story of their suffering was deemed too horrific for the jubilant public back home, a dark secret hidden behind the ticker tape parades. The end of the war did not mean order. It meant the explosion of Europe into a single, vast ocean of lost humanity. Millions of displaced persons, or DPs, were on the move. This mass included the liberated POWs, but also civilian slave laborers, concentration camp survivors, and refugees. The first priority for the Allies was simple: control the chaos, stop the spread of disease, and provide food. The liberated POWs were herded into massive processing centers and transit camps, where they were blasted with clouds of white DDT powder to kill the lice, stripped of their vermin-infested rags, and issued new uniforms. It was a jarring, bureaucratic limbo. They were no longer prisoners, but they were not yet free. They were trapped in a new kind of camp, waiting for a name to be called from a list, waiting for a ship, a plane, and a way home. But for millions of forgotten POWs, liberation was a betrayal and a death sentence. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers, who had been captured by the Nazis, were liberated by the Western Allies. They cheered the American and British tanks, believing they were safe. They were wrong. Under the terms of the Yalta Agreement, a political deal struck with Joseph Stalin, the Allies agreed to a forced repatriation of all Soviet citizens. Stalin had infamously declared that any Soviet soldier who surrendered was a traitor to the motherland. In Operation Keelhaul, Allied soldiers, at bayonet point, forced these terrified Soviet expos onto trains and ships. Many jumped overboard, preferring suicide to what they knew awaited them. They were handed over to the Soviet and KVD secret police. Some were shot on the docks. The rest were sent to the gulags. They had survived Hitler's camps only to be murdered or enslaved by their own liberator, Stalin. For the American, British, Canadian, and Australian POWs, the day finally came. They boarded ships for the long voyage home. This journey was a surreal decompression chamber, a bridge between two worlds. For the first time in years, they ate rich food, slept without fear, and were treated not as numbers, but as men. They were issued new uniforms, a symbolic resurrection. They spent the days and nights on deck, talking, sharing stories, and forging a unique brotherhood that only they could ever understand. As their ships pulled into New York Harbor, past the Statue of Liberty, or into the port of Southampton, they were met with a joyous, thundering explosion of ticker tape, brass bands, and weeping families. For a shining, glorious moment, they were not forgotten. They were the heroes of the hour, the living symbols of a hard-won victory. The parades were glorious, The keys to the city were an honor. The banquets were wonderful. And then, within a week or two, they ended. The ex-prisoners of war, still thin and haunted, went home. But the home he had dreamed of for years no longer existed. He returned to a wife who had been running the family and the finances for 3 or 4 years. A woman who was now a capable, independent stranger. He returned to children who didn't remember him, who were shy or even afraid of this gaunt, quiet man who had replaced their daddy in the photographs. The world had moved on. His job was gone. His friends were different. He was a hero to the nation, but a stranger in his own kitchen. The universal expectation was that he would simply get on with it, put on a civilian suit, and pick up exactly where he had left off. But the man who had returned was not the boy who had left. The true, lifelong battle, the one that made them forgotten heroes, was the one they fought inside their own minds in 1945. There was no diagnosis for what they carried. Today, we call it severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They called it war neurosis, shell shock, or, more often, they called it nothing at all, suffering in a profound and isolating silence. They had uncontrollable nightmares that left them screaming, drenched in sweat. They were prone to sudden, terrifying fits of rage, often triggered by something as simple as a child spilling milk. Or they would fall into long, brooding silences, mentally transported back to the camp. Many hoarded food in pockets, in car glove boxes, under their beds a-deep. Subconscious reflex from years of systematic starvation. They were physically free, but the barbed wire was now in their minds. The prisoner was still locked inside. The psychological scars were invisible, but the physical ones were a daily, agonizing reminder. The systematic, prolonged starvation in the camps had done permanent, irreversible damage. For the rest of their lives, many ex-POWs were plagued by a host of chronic, debilitating conditions. Their digestive systems, having been forced to process tree bark, grass, and rats, were shattered, leading to a lifetime of ulcers and nutrient absorption problems. Vitamin deficiencies had ruined their bodies. Lack of vitamin A destroyed their eyesight. Lack of vitamin B led to the nerve damage of beriberi. Lack of vitamin C meant their teeth fell out. The survivors of the Pacific, who had endured tropical diseases, were even worse off. Chronic malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot would flare up, without warning, for decades. Their bodies had survived the war, but the war would continue to wage a slow, painful battle against their bodies for the rest of their shortened lives. The story of the Axis POWs was a journey in reverse, a descent into the very world the Allies had just escaped. Millions of German soldiers, who had been held in camps in America, Britain, and Canada, were now repatriated. The ones held in America, the lucky ones, had been well-fed, healthy, and often put through extensive re-education programs in democracy. They returned with a pro-American worldview, but they returned to stunned null, 0 hour. They were sent back, not to a triumphant homeland, but to an apocalyptic landscape of rubble. They stepped off trains into the skeletal remains of their cities, their families dead or scattered. They were the enemy, defeated and shamed, and their return was not a celebration, but the beginning of a long, new struggle for survival in the ruins. The unlucky German prisoners of war, however, were the millions who had been captured by the Red Army. For them, the war did not end in 1945. Of the 90,000 men who surrendered at Stalingrad, only 5,000 ever saw Germany again. They were not treated as prisoners, but as war reparations in human form. They were classified as a slave labor force and were marched to the vast, frozen gulag system of Siberia to rebuild the very country they had tried to destroy. For more than 10 years, after the war's end, they labored in coal mines, quarries, and logging camps in sub-zero temperatures, dying by the thousands from starvation and disease. The last of them were not released until 1956, after a plea from the West German Chancellor. They were truly forgotten, their graves marked only by the frozen tundra, ghosts of a war that refused to end. The Japanese POWs held by the Allies faced the most unique and psychologically fraught return of all. In their fanatical military code, they had committed the ultimate, unforgivable sin. They had surrendered. They were living symbols of shame. After being re-educated in Allied camps and taught the basics of democracy, They were sent back to a nation that was as alien to them as they were to it. They returned to a Japan that was occupied by the very men who had defeated them. Their cities were firebombed ashes, their emperor was no longer a living god, and their entire military, the center of their universe, was disbanded. Many had already been declared dead by their families, who had held funerals for them. To return was to bring dishonor. They were forced to lie, to invent stories of being a laborer in Manchuria. Anything but admit the truth. I was a prisoner. The 1950s and 1960s were a period of determined optimism, of suburban booms, new cars, and rock and roll. The world wanted to look forward, not back. This was the era of the Great Silence. The former prisoners of war, the forgotten heroes, did not and could not talk about their experiences. It was seen as unmanly, as complaining, as bringing down the mood. When their children asked, "Daddy, what did you do in the war?" they would reply with a terse, "I was away," and change the subject. How could they describe eating rats to a wife who was worried about crabgrass? How could they explain the sound of a friend being beaten to death to a son who wanted to play catch? They couldn't, so they buried their medals, their photographs, and their nightmares in the back of a drawer. Their heroism was not just that they had survived, but that they carried their crippling, invisible burdens in complete, stoic silence. It was only decades later, as these men reached old age in the 1970s and 1980s, that the silence finally began to break. The clock was ticking. They had a moral obligation to bear witness. Before they were all gone, not for their own fame, but for the sake of the men who didn't come home. Spurred by historians and a new generation's curiosity, they began to talk. The survivors of the Bataan Death March, the heroes of Stalag Luft III, the men of the Burma Railway. They began to hold reunions. These reunions became their group therapy, the only place on earth they felt truly understood. They wrote memoirs. They lobbied their governments, fighting for medical recognition from the Veterans Affairs, which had for decades denied their claims, stating their chronic illnesses were not service-related. It was their last fight, a fight to be remembered. The collected, horrific testimony of these forgotten heroes sent a shockwave through the post-war world. The atrocities committed against prisoners of war, from the Nazi death marches to the Japanese hell ships and the Soviet gulags, were a clear, undeniable sign that the old rules of war were not enough. In 1949, in direct response to these horrors, the nations of the world convened in Switzerland. The result was the Third Geneva Convention. It was a revolutionary legal document, written in the blood and suffering of the very men the world had tried to forget. For the first time, it explicitly and in great detail outlawed torture, guaranteed access to medical care and food, mandated neutral inspection of camps by the Red Cross, and established a framework for humane treatment. It was their suffering that built a new, stronger wall of international law. The forgotten heroes of the Second World War are almost all gone now. Theirs was a generation that believed in duty, endurance, and quiet, uncomplaining sacrifice. They came home not as conquering demigods, but as deeply damaged men who nonetheless put on a suit, went to work, and rebuilt the world. They carried a dual burden, the public myth of the good war, a story of clear, righteous victory, and the private, nightmarish reality of what they had truly endured. Their legacy is not just in the families they raised or the nations they rebuilt, but in the profound moral lesson they represent. Their suffering reminds us that a nation's character is not just defined by how it fights its wars, but by how it treats its captives and, perhaps most importantly, by how it remembers its own heroes long after the ticker tape parades have been swept away. If you liked this video and want to see more like it, remember to like and subscribe for more daily content like this.